I'm Christina Jang from ITDP and would like to welcome you to the webinar today. Before we begin, there are a couple of things to note. The webinar will be recorded and both the recording and PowerPoint will be available online on our website within a week. To interact with our hosts today, please submit your questions through the Q&A function, which is either at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen, instead of using the chat box. We also encourage you to enter questions throughout the presentation. Again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is titled Urban Mobility in Brazil, Measures for Adaptation to Climate Change. Building on a study conducted by ITDP Brazil in partnership with the Ministry of Cities, this webinar will discuss how urban mobility systems in Brazil face vulnerability to climate change. Today, we will learn about climate change trends and projections for increased average temperature and precipitation, as well as extreme weather events occurring in Brazil. We will also review the Urban Mobility Vulnerability Index and provide guidelines for adaptive measures to reduce the effects of climate change on urban mobility in Brazilian cities. As for our host today, it is Clarisse Cunha Linke, the Country Director of ITDP Brazil. She has 14 years experience in social policy planning and implementation in Brazil, Mozambique, and Namibia. Currently, she is a member of the Board of Directors of SLOCAT, the Sustainable Low Carbon Transport Network, and other key associations in Brazil, such as the National Association of Public Transport and Municipal Council of Rio de Janeiro Transport. Her past work includes the Bicycling Empowerment Network in Namibia of Directors, which is the largest community-based enterprise bicycle distribution network in sub-Saharan Africa. She was also awarded the 2010 Ashoka Changemakers Challenge for Women, Tools, and Technology. Clarisse, you can go ahead and unmute your microphone, and whenever you are ready, you can share your presentation.
Sure, wonderful. Thank you, Christina, and thanks to everybody who is joining us today. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. I hope you can all see it. So, as Christina said, I lead the ITDP office in Brazil. We are based in Rio here, but our main headquarters is in New York, and we work promoting high quality transport systems. We have very specific focus on more livable cities, equitable and sustainable. And we play a very important and very interesting role bridging the public sector, civil society, and private sector agendas. So this is our scope of work in the country. And today what I'm going to talk to you is first, I'm going to introduce you very briefly to the urban mobility context in Brazil. I'm going to then start by presenting this work we did together with the Ministry of Cities and with funding from the UK Prosperity Fund, the British Embassy. It was a work that we started in 2015. And it was towards constructing an adaptation plan for the urban mobility systems in the country. So I will start by talking about the current vulnerability of the existing systems, all the future projections we did with climate indicators, and how we move with making an assessment of the city's vulnerability to climate change. And I will wrap up by bringing some measures that could be pushed forward by all the different actors. So starting with the urban mobility in Brazil, we are mostly an urban country. We went from being in 1950s, only 1/3 of our population was urban, and today we are 84% urban. The majority of the population lives in metropolitan regions, okay? And the most important aspect, I think, what we understood at the end of this work about adaptation, about the vulnerability of the urban mobility systems, is that we are very spread out in the territory. So our population increased by 76% in 4 decades, but the area we occupy increased by 127%. And this brings a lot of limitations since we lack enough transport infrastructure. in the last decade with all the big investments that were done with the previous governments. We had more than 150,000 reais, billion reais, yes, pledged for transport infrastructure, but we had less than 10% of it executed. So we still have a huge deficit of public transport infrastructure in the country. We have very poor service as well. So there is a high, an increasing motorization rate in the country, right? So this also brings a lot of limitations. We have very high average travel time. It's 38 minutes, in particular for who lives in the metropolitan region. And just to make an important point, which is very particular to the Latin American countries and to Brazil, is that who lives in the periphery is the poor community, right? So we demand from the poor community a lot of pendular trips daily to access the city's opportunities. And of course, that results also in a very high greenhouse gas emissions related to transport in the country. Since 2001, the country has moved a lot of climate change and urban mobility policy frameworks. And I'm bringing this here briefly, just because at the end, any adaptation that we do to the urban mobility systems needs to put together both climate change, the climate change debate and understanding and knowledge and indicators of climate change and all of that, but also all the urban mobility policy frameworks that we have. On the bottom, you will see that from 2001, the cities became really a very important venue for decision-making and discussion in the country. We had the Ministry of Cities established, but ongoing insufficient resources to fund transport. In 2009, we started having a lot of pockets of money from the growth acceleration programs, the PAC programs, the World Cup PAC, the Mobility PAC, the Large Cities PAC, and this is where we had this 150 billion pledge that I mentioned previously. In 2013, we had a lot of the street protests around throughout the country, and also again another pledge for urban mobility infrastructure. And on the top, you will see that we have the climate change policy framework. So also we have a national plan on climate change. We have a national policy already regulated. Sectorial plans started to being developed. And in 2013, there was a transport sectorial plan on climate change that aimed to have both mitigation and adaptation strategies. But at that point, the adaptation was not contemplated in the policy. So in the plan. So they released the one, although it's named mitigation and adaptation, they released it only with the mitigation component. And then there was this demand that in 2 years, and then the demand is that every 2 years it needs to be reviewed. In 2 years, it would be reviewed to contemplate adaptation. In 2015, then the Ministry of Environment began the process of putting together all the different sectors to discuss a national adaptation plan. And that's when the Ministry of Cities started looking at the urban mobility sector. And that's how we came on board in this partnership. So the first stage of this work was to understand the current vulnerability of the existing systems, right? We had a very steep increase in the frequency of natural disasters compared to the previous decade. So we increased it by 270%. And we can see it, and we got just a few photos here from media, from newspapers, but we can see many different reasons why that happened, right? Either the systems are normally in areas that are prone to flooding. So this was a train system in Maceió. The systems the city overall has inadequate maintenance of drainage systems, which results in a lot of flooding. Right, the systems with rains and with lack of proper maintenance and proper infrastructure, we always have a lot of system interruption. And these are in areas like São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro. This is a very frequent photo where the population lives 2 hours distance from the city center, and they do need to make this daily pendular trip. So they have no alternative. And when a system is interrupted, they need to just either not go to work or use whatever means they have, right? Also, we have very inadequate maintenance of pedestrian walks, of equipments in general in the city, of trees. And so with any a storm day will very commonly result with photos like this, right? And again, this is in a very in an area in Rio de Janeiro that is very prone to flooding. So the areas that are already historically identified as areas prone to flooding, they still are areas where there is a lot of services going through. So there is no connection in terms of planning, of understanding what are the most problematic areas of the cities, but also what are the most important and crucial systems we have, so that probably they shouldn't be going through these very problematic areas, right? So these are very common photos that common situation we have everywhere. And we have also the precipitation. Normally it leads to very dramatic situation, but we also have, and this is a discussion we brought to this debate here, the issue with the hot temperature. Right, so the vehicles are not ready to deal with hot temperature. Even in Rio de Janeiro, after all the promises throughout the decades, and especially throughout the last years, to put AC in the whole fleet, we don't have it. Not even half, or about half of the fleet in Rio has AC. And for example, in days that is when it's very hot, the BRT, the fleet of the BRT, which is a new fleet, also cannot cope with the demand. And so not only the AC fail, but also the motor part of the buses fail due to very high temperatures. With that, the result is very, I mean, besides the dramatic result and the impact in people's lives, right? The daily challenge that they have to face to access work, to travel around the city. We see it's also another reason the services are so bad, the quality is so bad and so unreliable, that what we see is an increasing in the motorization rate in the country. So in the last years, we saw 111% increase in vehicles, and we saw over 300% increase in motorcycles and scooters. Public transport is still, however, the main mode of transport of the country. So we have 60% of trips are made by public transport and 30% on walking. However, these are systems that don't receive investment. First made this assessment. So how is the reality now? The study that is available, and both in English and in Portuguese, had in many details, right? But just to give an idea that vulnerability of systems to climate is not something new, right? It has happened throughout the time. It has increased dramatically in the last decade, but it's something that it's not new for the operators and it's not new for the governments. The problem now is that we have it with more frequency and with more intensity as well. So with that in mind, we start discussing, okay, how can we foresee? How can we forecast what's going to happen? And what are the risks, in fact, that we're talking about? And we had many discussions and capacity building activities with the UK SIP, which is the part of the University of Oxford, the Climate Change Initiative from the Geography University there, school, and to try to understand what is really risk. And so we can talk about the differences in climate, the variability of climate. We have to understand what is our emission scenario in the country and our land use scenarios and potential changes, but we also need to understand, so not only the hazards, but also and mostly the exposure that the systems have to this hazard. A system can be exposed, but it doesn't necessarily need to be exposed. And the vulnerability of the system overall. And the vulnerability will then include not only the hazard and the potential exposure to hazard, but also the adaptive capacity, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit further. So we also needed to have a very clear, a lot of very discussions to understand what is the adaptive capacity of a city or of a system, of the socioeconomic situation and the governance situation of the city. So all the climate and socioeconomic processes are drivers for us to understand risk. So a city can have a lot of rain and it does not flood, right? Or it can have some rain, enough for the city to flood. So it is very peculiar. It's very local specific. Also, this was a very important lesson. It cannot be done top down. It cannot be done at a national level, an adaptation plan. It has to be done at the most local level. And like it can be focused on a system, a specific system, or it can also be a city, and then it has to include many different systems, but it has to be extremely bottom up to, in fact, address all the different issues. When we started discussing the climate change impact and the risks in regards to the transport system, you also have to have a very good understanding about where you are, right? Because we could talk about temperature, precipitation, we could talk about droughts, you could talk about cyclones, you could talk about snow. So in the case of Brazil, because it was work done at the national level, we look at temperature and precipitation. What we understood at the end is that in some cases of precipitation, we will in fact have some stronger droughts in the northeast of the country, for example, which can also have an impact in the transport system. But we chose at the beginning to look at temperature and precipitation as two indicators that could affect most of the country. So again, it has to be very local specific to address, to be able to give you a good picture about what needs to be adapted. Sea level rise is also something important, but something very difficult in terms of data. And so that's why we worked basically at the beginning with temperature and precipitation. In both cases, we were looking at the increasing average and the extreme events, because these are two different things that are gonna happen, that are already happening. So in the case of temperature, we were looking the number of days per year that we will have higher temperatures above 30 degrees. There was a lot of discussion in terms of choosing 30 and 32 degrees, and at the end for the modeling, we chose 30. And the extreme events, so the number of 6 or more consecutive days of a very high temperature per year, so days of heat waves that we would have in the country. In terms of precipitation, we look at the number of wet days per year, so what would be the increase, and also the number of days with storms. In both cases, we had two horizons. So one, we would call it medium term, and another one, longer term horizons. We used two regional climate models, and we had some, and in the scenarios, we also factor in scenarios with major or minor concentration of greenhouse gas. We looked at 283 municipalities in the country, so we were looking at places with more than 100,000 inhabitants. And all of this is very detailed in the study, even the formula, the equation, the methodology in detail. I'm not going to go through that here with you. I mean, it's available and I can share if you want later. But just to give a glimpse of what we got in terms of climate indicators. We have, it's clear that there will be an increase in the number of days with high temperature in the country. In the medium-term scenario, and I mean, these are the most pessimistic scenarios here, we would have an additional 50 days a year, but in the longer-term scenarios, we would have up to 200 days. So this is, I mean, 2/3 of the year, basically, right? Almost that, with higher temperatures, and these are always compared to the 1990 averages. In terms of heat waves, we would also have a very a sharp increase. In the first scenario, we have about 50 days. So the medium-term scenarios, we have 50 days extra additional of heat waves days. So these are those days of extreme heat that the ACs in the buses don't work, that some train systems can stop, for example. And in the long-term scenarios, we can have in some parts of the country up to 200 days additional with heat waves. This is like very clear why people would move to private transport if they have public transport that cannot cope with that, right? In terms of number of wet days, we would have more wet days, but these would be more particular in the southern region of the country, which is an area already where most of our flooding happens throughout the year. So this is already our most problematic area. So we would have more wet days throughout the year. And in terms of storm, we would have 9 extra days per year of those extreme stormy days when like the buses are completely under the water. So this is something that can be extremely problematic for management, for the management of the system from the operator perspective, but also from the public, from the government perspective, right? 9 extra days is a lot for a government and for an operator to cope with. And it has a lot of risks attached. And here we are not even talking about all the other health problems that these situations can lead to. We were looking only specifically at the impact on the urban mobility system, the interruption and how it impacts people's lives. So with that in mind, we had those maps, those large maps. They gave us a lot of very, very good information. But we wanted them to try to understand what was the reality of the cities in the metropolitan region, to putting all of this together, not only the climate changes, but also what is the adaptive capacity of some cities. So for that, we created the Urban Mobility Vulnerability Index. And what we had are two, it's compounded by two sets of factors. One is the sensitive factors. So it has social, economic factors like urban vulnerable groups. So what is in this city? How many people under 10 years old? How many people over 65 years old? How many people with disabilities, visual, hearing, motor, mental disabilities, divided by the total population. So we understand what is the vulnerability of the population, and then putting it together with the municipal GDP, with commuting average time, so issues related to urban mobility systems, with the travel quality here would be an average of percentage of urban households with sidewalking in the surroundings and with tree shade and with ramps, and so issues related to the pedestrian infrastructure. What is the public transport system's diversity? For example, in the metropolitan region of Rio de Janeiro, we have only train. We don't have other transit systems. Some areas we have only bus. We don't have other systems. So we have only, the population can only have a plan A, right? And we would have also population density, then the biophysical characteristics, so issues related to climate and disasters and populations in areas of at risk of coastal flooding. So we were looking at the sensitive issues, right, and the exposure issues. And then we had another set which looks at the adaptive capacity, right? What is the social capacity of the population? What is the capacity of the government? And what is the governance in this place? So in terms of public finance, it's a big average as well. And in terms of the institutional structure, we have characterization of the transport management body, existence of plans to adaptation, studies, and etc. So what is really the capacity of this government to deal with climate change, with extreme events, to deal with planning? With that, we plot the 283 cities, and we had these 4 levels of vulnerability. The ones with the superior vulnerabilities, in fact, the ones at the bottom, the red ones, right? So the ones with with the most vulnerable municipalities that have very high, that have a high sensitivity and very lower values for adaptive capacity. And the green ones on the top are the ones that have low sensitivity and higher capacity. Normally are the capital cities. That's what we see there. Not all of them, but we see some capital cities on the top from the Southwest. So these are more, it's richer areas, right? And the bottom one, what we have is mostly cities in the metropolitan regions. So they are not capital cities with the exception of Salvador, Bahia, but they are cities that live in the surrounding or in the outskirts. Basically, they are dormitory cities, right? That depend a lot on the capital city. So most of the population leaves daily to go work in the capital city and return. Overall, while analyzing all the criteria we put, we can say that what most contributed to sensitivity was the high average travel time. So, and that's why we see that in the cities, in the metropolitan areas, dormitory cities mostly. The higher levels of very precarious pedestrian infrastructure and the very low diversity of transport systems. So transport from, going back to this, the urban mobility systems little box here in sensitivity factors was something that impacted dramatically these cities that are situated in the lower part of the chart. The municipalities with the highest vulnerability are located in the metropolitan area of Rio de Janeiro. So surprisingly probably for foreigners, that would sound surprisingly because Rio is a very internationally important city in the country, but in reality, we know that the metropolitan region of Rio de Janeiro is one of the poorest in the country, so it does make sense. And also the metropolitan region of Pernambuco, in particular, the cities around the Recife metropolitan area. São Paulo cities are cities that are much better situated, the ones in the metropolitan region of São Paulo. And here just showing when we put also together the map of the high vulnerability in the metropolitan area of Rio. This is, you can see here on the bottom part, Rio de Janeiro is just the city, the main city where we have 6 million people. But all the rest is the metropolitan region of Rio, with the exception of the ones on the top, Petrópolis, Teresópolis, but the ones surrounding Rio, the metropolitan region. Duque de Caxias in the northern part of Rio is the city with the worst situation of the country, right? And it is also, when we put that together with the mobility system, in the case of Rio, of the metropolitan area, is where we have a very high percentage of residents spending more than 1 hour commuting. So the cities that are on the top part with the orange color, they have the worst indicators. So for example, you see Japeri on the top, 54% of the population spends more than 1 hour commuting daily. They go to Rio de Janeiro. This is the whole population that uses the train system, the train that has very low quality of service, where investments are not as steady and as high as they should be. And this is a population that depends daily on Rio. These are basically dormitory cities. And when there is any climate change, any event, extreme event, this is the most affected population that we have. This is also our very large periphery in the metropolitan area of Rio. And when we look that with the risk of flooding due to sea level rise map, again, you see also Duque de Caxias, São João de Meriti, Belfor Roxo, areas that are also part of the Baixada, that are served by the train system, that don't have many other options, that depend daily on coming on this long commute, and areas that are at the bottom, at the end of the bay, and areas that are very prone to flooding. So all the systems that are put in there are very exposed to flooding. But the problem here, is not only the exposure, but again, the adaptive capacity. So these are cities, extremely poor cities, with limited governance, with limited financial capacity from the government. So all of this together gives us the vulnerability index. With that in mind, we started trying to understand, okay, what can be the recommendations. It is a challenge because, again, it has to be done really bottom up. So it's not the government, the federal government can only give guidelines, right? So we do depend on have really local mobilization. The main framework of thinking here is, the first one is the avoid, shift, and improve, which is this international strategy to ensure the maximum of 2 degrees increase scenario. So the first of it, it's avoid. So we need to avoid or reduce the need of travel. So that's how the transport system can contribute and also not be so much affected by climate change, or contribute to the 2-degree scenario and not be so much affected by climate change, right? So we need to look at the system efficiency and reduce or avoid the need to travel. So we need to have more compact cities and with higher density and with mixed use, so that the population doesn't need to be this pendular trip, as we see, for example, in the case of Rio, and why Rio ranked so bad and the cities in the metropolitan region of Rio. The second one is shift. So when we need to travel, we need to maintain clear or have cleaner modes. And this is exactly the opposite to what's happening now. Right, the population is increasingly going to motorized private vehicles and motorbikes and scooters. And the third one, as part of this, is the improve. So we need to look at the vehicle efficiency. These, together with the transit-oriented development principles, are really the crucial way for us to have a long-term, well-adapted system, city, in fact, right? So develop neighborhoods where we promote walking, prioritize cycling networks, have very good high quality public transport, plan for compact, mixed use, and dense cities. But when we look, so coming from these 2 broad frameworks, how can the cities really start working on climate change? Also, an important point that needs to be made is that this climate, these indicators are forecasts, right? And there is a lot of questioning still, where are they accurate enough or not? How are governments and public and private sector gonna invest in something that they are not 100% sure? So there is a lot of awareness raising that needs to be done, and convincing for government to really invest in something that is a projection, but it's a projection that doesn't give certainty, right? So this is, I would say, a big challenge. And we saw that from the municipal level, and with all the discussions we had throughout the time. Are we going to invest a lot of money for an infrastructure that we don't know if this is really going to happen and how this is really going to impact? But when it impacts, it's going to be very expensive. And the damage is extremely high at in particular in the social dimension for the population, especially when you're talking about the poor income levels. So at the policy level, in the case of Brazil, for example, we do have the mobility plans, we do have the urban development plans, we do have this policy framework in place that allows cities and metropolitan regions to start this bottom-up planning. And the need to put these plans together and putting these plans together with housing plans, with sanitation plans, this is crucial. So if we look in the case of Rio, for example, the place where most Minha Casa Minha Vida social housing developments were located throughout the last decade were exactly in this extremely far away periphery, demanding the population this pendular trip. So these plans need to be integrated. We also need to talk at the metropolitan scale. In the case of Brazil, many of our policies are done at the city level, at the city scale, but the population that is going to be mostly impacted by climate change is at the metropolitan level, and it is daily crossing boundaries between cities. So we cannot do this planning at the city level just within the city boundary. It's crucial that in the case of Rio, we have more than 2 million people entering the city of Rio daily to come to work from exactly those municipalities that are in the surrounding. So it has to be done in the metropolitan scale. It has to include different actors. The government alone cannot do the adaptation plan. I forgot to put here academia, which is obviously very important to be involved. I apologize for that. The private sector operators, they need to be involved. They have already been dealing with climate impacts. They already have some systems in place, contingency systems, and etc. So they already have some solutions, and they know where are the vulnerabilities specifically to their systems. So they have to be super involved, and they need to be working together as well. We need to create redundancy in the system. So if the population cannot come by train because the train was interrupted, how will the bus system, for example, step in very quickly and give an alternative for this population, for this group? So this work together and the need to create redundancy is crucial. We do need also to identify the most vulnerable group, because this is the group that takes public transport daily, and that their livelihoods depends on these pendular trips. Of course, in the long term, we have to be thinking about transit-oriented development so that they live in centralities that are strong enough for them not to need to do this pendular trip. But this is part of their daily reality, and we do need to understand how the vulnerable groups can have enough information about what to do. Some examples here of things that are not properly done. Again, in the case of Rio, since I was using many examples, I think it becomes easier to identify in the map. The Rio has a train system, the ones that goes to the northern part of the system. And recently there was some investments in subway and in the LRT, but all in the southern part of the city. What you see in the dots, in the yellow dots, are the low income population, and the purple dots are the high income population. And most of investments that were done in the past years, they were where the high income population lives. However, it is the yellow dots on the northern part of the city, in these cities in the metropolitan region. This is exactly where the population comes. 2 million people enters daily the city. That's not where most investments are happening. So if we see the people near transit indicator, you see, okay, the metropolitan region of Rio, you can see in the first table on the top, there was a little increase from 23% of the population living near transit to 31%. It was a minor increase. The increase was higher in the city level because the investments were done in the subway and in the LRT, right? So, okay, Rio is now the city with the highest level of people near transit. But when we analyze that per income, we see that the lower income population didn't benefit that much, right, compared to the higher income population. So this is also part of the analysis, and this is a crucial aspect if we want to decrease or mitigate the impact of climate change in the poor population. Now, where is that we are putting our infrastructure? How is the population using that? And how we create redundancy of the transport infrastructure for this population. In terms of infrastructure planning, of course, we need first to make an assessment of the existing infrastructure and service. And obviously, the most important thing is that we include the adaptation measures in the design stage when you are putting together new infrastructure. And I'm emphasizing here this because I'm going to show what happened in Rio with very new projects that didn't include these adaptation measures. Right? Didn't even consider new indicators, new climate indicators. But also we can consider windows of opportunities, so ways that are less costly and more beneficial for existing systems. So the systems are going through a lot of renovation normally, They have maintenance cycles, they have process in the planning, the review of sectoral plans. So there is an opportunity to start incorporating incremental adjustments for climate change, adapting the system that you don't need to invest in completely new systems. You can improve your existing systems, include new standards in the existing systems through the maintenance cycles, for example. So this is something very important, and many cities across the globe that are working on adaptation have been thinking about it. This is a project that was delivered in 2013 in Rio de Janeiro, in an area that was already extremely prone to flooding, etc. And this is a BRT system, and what we see is that there was absolutely no consideration for what was going to happen with much more frequency than used to happen before. So a new system that is already affected. And obviously the most famous one we had, and it was exactly at the time we were doing this work, was the bike lane, the iconic bike lane that was delivered for the Olympics in an area that historically, since 1921, we found articles in the newspaper, already had problems with waves. So sometimes with a higher sea level, we would have some gigantic waves like this, but now this is getting more frequent. So in many debates with the construction companies and with the government, they were saying, no, but this is a 50-year wave, and we cannot consider 50-year wave in the planning. The issue is just now that the 50-year wave is now the new 20-year wave. And so how is this being incorporated in the planning, right? 2 people died in the day it fell. Just very brief examples here. There are many that can be shared later on, but I think New York is, after all the big the Sandy and etc. that happened in New York, many analysis and scenarios were done trying to understand, and a very radical one trying to understand like 100-year flood zones for New York City. So, for example, the situation with this bike lane here, if it was looking at this horizon, that wouldn't have been delivered that way, right? So New York moved towards so from a planning perspective, looking at a longer term and understanding that the extreme events are not going to be that ad hoc anymore. They're going to be more frequent. Brisbane did the same, and they started looking at the 1,000-year event would in fact be something they would need to include in their planning. So this is, from a planning perspective, something very important. What is the time frame you include in your planning for the extreme events? And start doing also a lot of more basic infrastructure that deals with, that is part of a contingency plan. So deployable stair covers, mechanical closure device for specific vents, sealing some duct entry points. So there was a whole mapping of the system of all the entry points of water and etc. What can be done? How can we improve? And above all, how can we create redundancy in the IT network capacity as well? And also what was done in New York, what has been done is an emergency communications plan with employee and with passenger. In the case of London, also I like this example because it's a very simple example. How as part of the adaptation plan in London, they started the installation of white panels on the top of the buses to reflect the rays of summer and then keep the vehicle cooler, because the issue with temperature is becoming clearly a problem in London and a problem for their mobility system. And for example, the Transport for London also started installing tanks to collect rainwater at the rail depots, because there is an understanding that there will be more droughts. And so with droughts, they couldn't, more frequent droughts, they couldn't wash the trains. So they are now collecting water to be able to keep the maintenance and washing the trains. So these are apparently simple solutions, right? Part of the operations, part of the maintenance that can be included. In the case of London, also there there has been a lot of work done with councils, schools, and hospitals being advised that risks, preventive steps that they can take. So it's not only government and non-operator work, it's work that needs to be done with all the different players, because the community is impacted and the community needs to also devise their own strategies. And finally, just a broader strategy like the big green fund in London, providing like grants for environmental improvements, better walking, better cycling, green spaces, and in particular in areas where it would help to manage flood risk, to decrease flood risk, right? So, and just to finalize, I think this is also part of what I mentioned now in London, but develop these stronger connections between the discussion about adaptation of a system with the discussion about disaster risk and sustainable development overall, right? The issue with climate change and impact in the city is a result of the city we have been building. So we need to review the form we built the city, right? And this is at the core or at the center of the discussion about adaptation. Raise awareness among all different groups. It's not one man's job or one woman's job in any case. Integrate systems and social impact analysis. It's not only the discussion about the bus that is hot, but what is this? What is the impact in the population? Who uses this bus? How does it impact access to work, to their livelihood, strategies, and etc. And above all, data. I think data is one of the crucial problems we face throughout this work, and understood that without data, there is not much that can be done. We cannot give visibility to the problems, and without visibility, unless there is just an extreme event, but without giving visibility with data, we don't engage the government and the operators. They are not going to invest on adaptation if the problem is not visible enough. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Clarisse, for this presentation. And now is the time that we can enter Q&A. We have about 13 minutes to answer questions from the audience. We already have one submitted here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. The model shows projections over medium and long-term scenarios. Given that government officials have short terms, might these scenarios be too far-fetched? How do we inspire immediate action to improve our existing daily lives?
Oh, this is a very good point. And in the Brazilian case, I don't think only in the Brazilian case, but here we see we would need to talk about today only, right? To be able to engage our governments, because they look only within the next 2 years, not even 4, because the second part of the administration normally is already working for, unless they can renew. But I think just looking at what has already happened, looking at what is happening now is already something very relevant, right? We created the scenarios because we needed to have a long-term view, especially many investments were being done in Brazil in the last years, or were pledged to be done, right? And what we were seeing is that there was no discussion whatsoever about climate change in the projects that were under planning. And so we wanted to bring these scenarios to sort of show them that an investment that we make now, an infrastructure now, is the infrastructure that will be in 20 years, supposedly still have to address the needs of the community and face climate change. So that's why we were using the scenarios. But with the current problem we have now, those floods, photos, the temperature, these are issues that are happening now a lot across our cities. So the more we give visibility to that, the more we try to get involved with the different groups and with the operator and with the government to address these problems we are already having, the better. You know, it is already a big issue in our country. And it's just that what we say, oh, there is a flood. It affected the urban mobility system, but affected everything else. And we don't unpack all the systems to try to understand how does it impact all the different systems. If we look at the social dimension, we already can identify how it impacts the poor communities living in the metropolitan region. So there was no way for us to run these indicators with the model, with the different models we used for now, because it wouldn't give that much, useful data. We wanted to show that change is happening. And so that's more or less how we worked. And I think the issue about involving civil society and operators is because they go beyond the administration period, right? And also in the government, we do need to deal with the two different groups inside the government. The leadership that comes and goes, and that is really looking at four-year deliverables, results, but we do have the technical staff, the professionals that stay there, the servants that stay there, and we need to work with them as well. And we need to understand that they are the ones that will take these ideas and projects and discussions in between administrations. So we have to have strategies to work with these two different groups within the government.
Great, thank you so much, Clarisse. For the next question, can you please go back to the slide where you showed the urban mobility vulnerability index? I think that would be helpful for our audience as we answer this one.
The city. This or this?
Yes. This one, yes.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit more about the institutional structure for Brazil? For this index?
Here, what we have here is, by law, we need to do the mobility plans, okay, since 2012 with the National Urban Mobility Policy. And also in 2015, we had the Institute, the Metropolis Institute. So the cities in the metropolitan areas have to do the urban development integrated plans. Okay, what happens is that most cities are not putting these plans in place. Most of the time, they don't have resources to work on these plans. They don't have team allocated to work in these plans. Sometimes they are not interested. And many times there is no governance structure in place that really that they are accountable for. Right. So what we understood is that a city that has the capacity to plan, that has an accountability framework, right, is a city that is in general tends to be more prepared. So what we were looking here was, does this city has a transport management body? Many cities don't have, right? Of course, in a metropolitan scale, we should have a metropolitan like a transport authority. We rarely have a transport authority. So, and some cities don't even have a proper authority at the municipal level. So we're looking, does the city has, how is that constituted? Does the city has transport plans, mobility plans? Does the city has climate change plans? Does the city has studies that are looking at climate change? If there is an university locally that is working with the city or not. So it was an index of different instruments at the institutional level that could tell us how well planned is the city, how well planned can the city be, right? If there is governance structure in place for that. What we have learned in Brazil in these years of work is that our main problem is not our technical capacity. We do have great engineers and etc. Our main problem, and also there are many foreigners that could do that. This is not our challenge. Our challenge is our institutional capacity, our limited governance frameworks to put together this institutional framework. So institutional demands and plans and timeframes. And so that's why we decided to include that here.
Great, thank you, Clarisse. We have another question here. You have shown some inspiring examples of transportation adaptation to climate change from New York and London. Are there other examples that you can give from cities around the world? And from my end, maybe another city from the Global South. They also ask, is there a good database or compilation of these case studies anywhere anywhere, or any recommendations of some good sources of information?
To be honest, I can't really think about any example in this case in the Global South, but I would try to think about it. But in terms of other places, Australia and New Zealand, these are places that are very much ahead in the discussion, right? So they have many local plans, like Brisbane has a plan that is interesting. And it is, I think there is a thing called Climate Initiative Package, if I'm not mistaken. I can just get the name and send it. Maybe if we have the list of people participating, we can send some of these links after. So the Australian and New Zealand, these are places that are very well, much more organized dealing with disaster as well, right? And that they have good plans. London has a very good plan. So UK SIP is the UK Climate Initiative Project. You can Google that, UK SIP. And it's a project part of the University of Oxford that I mentioned. They do have a very interesting website with methodologies for adaptation plans, for the discussion on adaptation. Probably they have case studies there as well. They have a series of methodologies suggested for work with civil society, work with state, work with the private sector, and etc. So this, I would say, is a very good source of information. They, if I'm not mistaken, Scotland, and I think the UK SIP was involved in the plan in Scotland as well. So when we were researching, we were looking at these Anglo-Saxon countries, but I would imagine that in Europe and New York, I think it was a response to some of the recent disasters that they had, but probably there are some other cities also that are dealing with that, especially the ones in the coast. Normally the cities in the coast, in the coastal areas, are the cities that, of course, they are more threatened, so they tend to move forward with some discussions on adaptation. Okay, so and the University of Birmingham has a program, and the professor is called Andrew Quinn. Quinn is Quinn, if I'm not mistaken, and he leads a discussion on that as well. I think a research program or something like that. So he would be also a good source of information about it. If anyone has any interest, can send me an email and I can share some of these contacts or these links. I can just look for some of them here on my files.
Great, thank you, Clarisse. And there will be a follow-up email with all of these materials. So if you'd like, I can include these additional resources.
Sure.
For this next question here, I'm going to start with the second part first, which is there a publication on the Urban Mobility Vulnerability Index or adapted somewhere? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the forthcoming CAF article. And then the second part of the question is if our other field offices have a similar index.
Okay, I will start with the second question. This work on adaptation was done only in Brazil, in ITDP. And it was really this great opportunity we had with the Ministry of Cities. So that wasn't replicated in other offices. But if any other office is interested in doing something like that, we would love to share our experience. In terms of publications, there is the following. If the person is a Portuguese speaker, in the website of the Ministry of Cities, in the mobility page, there is a the detailed study, which we call the subsídios para o plano de adaptação. So the raw material that was used for the Ministry of Cities to prepare their part of the adaptation plan, the sectorial plan for the adaptation plan. In our Brazilian website, we do have a report, but if I'm not mistaken, I think we had a problem with our website, but I think we do have a report in Portuguese that we can share. If it's not in the website, should be. It is a summary of the whole study, and it has the Urban Mobility Vulnerability Index in detail. And we are gonna be, we work on a paper for CAF, the Agência Andina de Fomento, the multilateral agency here in the Latin America and in Latin America. And this paper is going to be launched within the next couple of weeks in the journal for CAF, and this is going to be in English. Okay, so we have been trying to produce different materials and trying to distribute them in Portuguese, in English, and trying to simplify a little bit. We do have the urban mobility vulnerability index in details with equation and all of that, and we have been trying to simplify a little bit as the need to give visibility to these problems, because so far it has been treated just from an academic perspective. So we need to make it more of an advocacy tool, and that's what we are trying to engage now in bringing this material to life.
Great, thank you. So let me see that we are up for time, and I see some questions about the CAF paper, the Development Bank for Latin America. And as of right now, to our attendees, it is not published yet, but as Clarisse said, it will be soon. And for anyone who attended today, I will definitely be following up once it is live, and it will be available in English. So we can conclude the webinar session. Clarisse, thank you so much for presenting these materials and sharing with us today. And I hope for our attendees, the materials that were shared can be applied to the cities where you are working and living as well. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. And if there is any need, can send me an email. If there is any question that we didn't have time to answer, Christina can send me and I can write. So yes, feel free to contact us at any time. Thank you. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. Take care now.